It's almost that time of year again, where we all run to the woods in droves to camp and enjoy the outdoors. Some people, though, don't have a positive experience. These subscribers sent in their allegedly true creepy as hell stories from camping deep in the woods. If you have a story you'd like to share in a future video, whether it be a camping story or something else, send it in at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share it with everyone here in the swamp. Now, let's get into these creepy stories from the woods. It was a warm summer afternoon. The golden shine of a setting sun bathed the grass and the trees in brilliant color. I and my friend Grant sat around a campfire, roasting shish kebabs and hot dogs. We were alone in the dense forest, the only ones at the campground. The fire snapped and popped as the sun dipped below the trees, casting shadows across the camp. Me and Grant shared scary stories and some funny stories, but then we fell silent. The sun was now out of sight and a feeling of fear had come over us. Then Grant stood up and declared that he was going to bed. He climbed into his tent and zipped it up, leaving me alone with a dying fire in dark forest. I sat for a few minutes, letting my hot dog char in the fire. That's when I heard a faint echo ring from behind me. It sounded like the wind, but sad and creepy. I turned around as chills traveled up my spine. Behind me was a dirt trail and across it was a few skinny trees, while behind was a grassy meadow surrounded by forest and illuminated slightly by the moon. The meadow was foggy, and I saw a tall figure moving about 6 blocks away. It walked along with a very long stride, coming slowly and closer. I freaked out and ran to Grant's tent and woke him up. He groggily followed me out and I pointed to where I last saw the figure. It was entirely still now, facing us. I was panicked now and so was Grant. So we took off on the trail where our car was. We knew it would be a good 10-minute run. We tore across the trail, never looking back, until we reached our car, at which point we quickly climbed in and sped away. We were almost out of the campground when we saw a tall figure walk into the road ahead of us. Grant slammed on the brakes and I closed my eyes tightly, but when I opened them, the figure was gone. Grant was panting heavily. The creature had just vanished. He continued driving, slower this time. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and what I saw will haunt me forever. A very tall and skinny person with a red plaid shirt and blue pants. He had no hair, ears, or nose, but had an enormous stretched skeletal grin and 2 huge round white eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. He held out his massive hands for me to see, and in the palms was a symbol. It was a bleeding eye. I yelled at Grant to go, and he did without questioning, for he had seen the monster too. He drove out of the campground and was almost on the main road. I was starting to relax when I looked at the rearview mirror again and saw the monster chasing us on all fours. It was easily keeping up with the car and gaining. Grant sped up even more, tearing across the final stretches of dirt road. The end of the forest was now in view. That's when I heard a loud thump land on top of the car. I checked the rearview mirror again and saw the monster was gone. I shivered as I heard scratching sounds from above me. It was on top of the car. I looked at the window to my right and got a close view of its scarred and rotting face. It was leaning over the top of the car and peering into the window at me, craning its long, bony neck. It extended a finger and tapped on the window. Grant kept driving and I just sat there too scared to move. Grant put on a sudden burst of speed and then slammed the brakes. The creature's legs went flying forward as it roared, hanging on with its thin hands. Grant sped away before the monster could regain balance and it flew off backward. We drove the rest of the way home at high speeds. Ever since then, I've never seen the man in plaid again. Long ago, when I was roughly 14, I was in a small Girl Scout group. I and the girls were going to a camp each year called Camp Kahino, close to Waldron, Arkansas. Kahino is located in a wooded area, so at times we would go camping outside under the stars or in teepees. The night this occurred, we all decided to go out to a secluded area in the woods, away from the roads. The nearest bathroom was possibly half a mile away if I recall correctly, so most of us had to go use the restroom outside. Our counselor, or leader, wanted us to learn how just in case. Like most, I was irked by it, but we thankfully had toilet paper so I brushed it off. Later that night, we were all huddled by a fire, telling stories. Not ghost stories, but just stories. Eating marshmallows and whatnot. I was sitting with my best friend Autumn during this, but around 11 p.m. or so, I had to potty pretty bad. So I grabbed what I needed and walked off to where I was hidden, but could see the fire still. I did also have a light with me. Well, while I was finishing up, I heard a loud shuffle of leaves behind me. I assumed it was something like a squirrel or a rabbit or something that would be common, so I ignored it. The sound got louder and closer. It eventually got so close it scared me and caused me to jerk around to see what it was. At first, it was indeed a rabbit, but it was running as if it was fleeing from something. I instantly got nervous and had a sour feeling. Hearing another shuffle, I glanced to my left and saw something inhuman. I can't fully describe it, but I'll do my best to. It was a human-like creature, standing maybe about 6 to 7 feet tall. It had deer-like horns and was lanky in appearance, but something about it, the aura it gave off, was unnerving. It had an evil grin, almost like you would assume a demon would have, and had deep, pure black orbs for eyes. Almost instantly upon seeing it, I let out a bloody scream, dropped my light, and immediately turned to run. I tried to get back to my group as fast as I can, and I'll be honest, I instantly told Autumn since she was about to check on me. She overheard my scream, so we went back to get my light despite my protest, and she assumed I saw an animal and got scared. Well, when we got back and found my light, we grabbed it, but heard munching. Autumn shone her light towards the creature, saw it, went pale, and grabbed my arm and fled. We saw it hunched over, eating that rabbit I saw fleeing beforehand. Thankfully, we left the next day, but to this day we refuse to go back to that part of Kahino. And to this day, the feeling of seeing that creature causes my blood to grow cold, and I'm 23 now. So first off, this is my friend's story, an experience out camping by himself in the Arizona wilderness. I will try to retell his story the best I can. I will write in his perspective of the story. I went hiking out in the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along with my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes or snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down, so I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and was woken up by a call from our mutual friend at around 20:30 and fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I could not move. I could hear rocks moving around outside the soft footfalls in the sand right next to my tent. I heard coyotes howling earlier, so I knew that's what these were. I was sleeping on my back to the wall of the tent, and one of those things pressed his nose into my back and sniffed for a good 3 minutes. I had sleep paralysis again, and I couldn't even grab my rifle to shoot the thing. The second thing happened a few hours later, at 0300 hours. This was a nightmare, not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke and peered through the window, and what I saw was a young woman and a child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, not more than 6 feet away. I asked them who they were. The child was silent, but the woman declared, Leave this place!" They each had a horrifying face, and I was able to grab my rifle. I tried to shoot them because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong. But the trigger wouldn't budge. She and the child stood at once and walked away into the shrub trees behind my tent. The woman walked on until I couldn't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because there was moonlight falling on the other side of the tree, I could watch her silhouette change shape. She became a gangly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed by my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all I was worth, and then she collided with my tent. In that instant, I woke up, screaming and throwing a wild punch into the wall of my tent. I was sitting up. Something also followed him on the way back to his car. I don't know if this is a skinwalker or something like that, but I've definitely heard that it was skinwalker territory. He said he's never been hiking in that spot again and plans to take someone with him next time. When I was 13, I went to a summer camp I had been attending for years called Victory Ranch. I had never had a problem there before, but my grandma had just passed away, and in a way, her death opened my third eye. Victory Ranch is a Baptist Christian camp, so every day was filled with chapel time, worship songs, and Bible verse memorizing stuff. Camp started normally. The camp usually had boys and girls cabins on separate sides of the land. The boys by the mess hall and the girls across the creek in these little condos. There were too many houses smack in the middle of the camp used for storage, but this year more kids meant one of them was opened for an additional girls' cabin. The cabins all had names. The boys' rooms were numbered and the girls were named after plants and flowers. But this new cabin had a whole different name. It was called Maverick. I got put in Maverick. The house layout was strange. Shower curtains separating rooms. One bath and shower for 9 girls. The first day went smoothly and I was wrapped up in nostalgia. Then it got dark. We normally had nighttime games, but our rec director said they were canceled that year. I felt bummed about it, because it was super boring without it. But I was super tired, and so my friend Annie and I headed back to our cabin. I crawled into bed and fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to flashing in the room. Annie had smuggled her BlackBerry to camp, and it was flashing an unnaturally bright white light. I got up to turn it off, but it was already off. How was it flashing? I woke up Annie to tell her that her phone was going nuts. Then I saw it. My bed was against the window. I had bottom bunk and Annie had the top. The curtains were opened, as if on a drawstring over and over again. I shook Annie awake. "Stop it, you're scaring me." She woke up. "Stop what?" "The curtains." "I'm not doing that." She was wide awake and out of bed in seconds. We stood there in horror as the curtains kept opening and closing. I felt things moving in the dark around me, shadows writhing. We ran and woke our counselor, who told us to get back to bed, and we obeyed, and spent the rest of the night crying silently, trying to ignore the curtains and the strange shadows all around us. The next day we looked like zombies. We were exhausted and freaked out that we had no fun that day, and when nightfall came back around, we tried to talk to our counselor again, who brushed us off again. That night was worse than the night before. The curtains were faster and would stay open longer. Each time I stared out the window, for sure, I felt something staring back. Like eyes burning into me, coming from the trees by the creek. The next day, stuff started happening during daylight. Our stuff would go missing, and we had awful headaches inside the house. Things went on like this for 2 more days, and we were getting desperate. We talked to the pastor, who basically told us we were imagining things. We were furious and exhausted. We had to go back to the cabin for something, but brought another friend since we were too scared to go. She complained of an awful headache as soon as she went inside. We hadn't told her about our head pains. Night fell, and we went to bed. That night it was like the intensity had been turned up to 10. After enough curtain opening, I remembered something my mom had told me. I was not Baptist, neither was my mom. She believed in demons and told me that I could use the name of Jesus to command the demon to go away. I started praying as hard as I could and had Annie pray with me. After about 40 minutes of this, it stopped. The curtains, everything. We passed out and slept like babies. The next day, everything felt fine. I was so happy it worked. We came back to the cabin for something around noon or so, when Annie suddenly lost consciousness, fell, and hit her head on the bunk ladder. When she came to, she was so out of it I carried her to the nurse. The nurse did nothing and said she was fine. She wasn't fine. What was wrong with everyone? In the mess hall, Annie passed out in her food in front of the nurse who did nothing. That was the last straw. I called my mom in hysterics from another counselor's phone. My mom was shocked. I had always had so much fun at camp, but I begged her to take me home. But after talking for a bit, I told her I would stay. I was going to come home the next day anyway, and I didn't trust the nurse to keep Annie safe. Night fell for the last time, and the activity was back with a vengeance. The curtains flying around, our bed shaking. Both of us could barely breathe. We sawed through the night and at dawn packed up as fast as we could. We walked past the back of the cabin on our way to the chapel when I saw it. A brown, partly decomposing hand opened the curtain one last time, and 2 yellow eyes peered out at us. My blood went cold. I couldn't break eye contact with it. It was staring right through me, looking at me with this hungry expression, like it was planning exactly how it would kill me. Annie saw it too, and we ran to the buses in tears as fast as we could. I never looked back and I never went back. Annie and I don't talk anymore. I don't talk to any of those people anymore. I have tried many things to rid myself of that darkness since, and nothing has worked. I walked away from my faith and I am a practicing pagan now. It's what's helping at the moment. The paranormal is just as normal as everything else in my life now. Many more paranormal things have happened since, but none of them has scared me this bad as that camping trip. I want to know what the thing was. Was it a demon or a monster, a spirit or something like that? I still see its razor teeth fill grin when I close my eyes. It's been 8 years, and there is still a part of me that's scared of sharing this story. I've tried to before, but was afraid it would be inviting some sort of energy back into my life. But I need answers. If anyone has any idea what I saw at Camp Victory Ranch, please let me know in the comments below. My dad runs a church camp for the mentally disabled. When I was 4, he brought me along and I had a great time, but for a different reason. I loved catching and collecting all the different insects there. I always released them on the last day of camp, of course. Ever since then, I've been going with him to help out and look for bugs. In 2011, we stayed in a cabin since the year before we stayed in a tent and mosquitoes almost ate us alive. The cabin had a hallway with 4 rooms, 2 on each side. So my dad and I used the first 2. On the second day of camp, I was alone in the cabin when my dad went off to set up stuff. I decided to play with my Lego Indiana Jones minifigures while I kept the insects I collected near me. Around 10 minutes passed and I began to hear a shaking and scratching noise coming from somewhere in the cabin. I chalked it up to being my bugs scratching in the little habitat windows I put them in, but when I checked on them a bit later, they were completely silent. I still heard that noise, so I went to inspect the cabin. While going through the hallway, I checked every door. When I got to the 3rd door, I found what the noise was. The 3rd doorknob was shaking by itself. Being around 7 years old at the time, I immediately ran out and found myself a counselor nearby. The counselor, thinking it was an animal, opened the door, which wasn't shaking anymore, and started trying to scare it out. Of course, there wasn't anything, and before leaving he said it must have been the wind. Years pass and I'm at McDonald's with some of the staff. I told them the short version of my story and they said they've all had paranormal experiences at the camp. One of them even said that the day she was alone in the manor there, she heard footsteps, but when she checked to see who was there, no one was to be seen anywhere within the property. During the 90s, TV shows like America's Funniest Videos were among some of my favorites. The videos I liked the best were when people would get kicked in the nads by an animal like a goat or the kids would whack them in the head with a big plastic bat. I spent many an evening in front of the TV doubled over laughing at others' bad luck. I'm aware that not all people find this kind of stuff funny, but I'd wager, judging from the popularity of the Three Stooges, that there's a lot of us out there that would definitely enjoy it, even if we don't care to admit it. However, since the following happened, I'm a lot less likely to mock others in their times of misfortune. Since I was about 10, the male members of my family, in the early years this consisted of my dad and his brother, took an annual trip to British Columbia to hunt moose. This usually took place around late September, or the closest time to that all those involved could get the time off. Since the first year of the hunt, I'd begged to go but was always told I was too young. This ritual was repeated year after year while I was 14, when I was finally decided that I was mature enough to handle it. Now, I'm going to stop here and address something I'm sure will come up in the comments once the story is posted. I am well aware that there are many reading this that hate hunting. I'm not here to field a bunch of angry comments regarding your feelings about the act of hunting animals. Send all those to PETA. I'm here to tell a story about something scary that happened in the woods. Well, now that I'm off my soapbox, I'll continue with the story. Being allowed to join the hunt, in my family, was sort of an unspoken rite of passage, an unofficial stamp that I was now a man, and you better believe that's how I felt. In order to prepare for the hunt, we made a trip to Cabela's to get all the stuff we would need. The remainder of the stuff was handled by the outfitter. All the way down to the flight in, at the end of September, everybody packed up for the long flight, and before I knew it, we were standing next to a small river that was base camp of every hunt since the beginning, 4 years before. We enjoyed a massive dinner that evening, and although I was exhausted, I got very little sleep that night, mainly due to the excitement. Morning came all too soon, but my adrenaline high kept me going. Before we left that morning, the outfitter held a brief safety meeting in order to remind all those attending that we were in a dangerous area. Whether it was a grizzly wolf or a rutting bull, we had to keep our eyes open because there was a lot of things in these woods that could hurt us and want to hurt us. After the meeting, we headed out. I was in a group with my uncle and one of the guides. After a hike of about 5 miles, with a pack on my back, I was starting to drag. The lack of sleep was catching up with me. The guide must have noticed I was tired because he suggested we take a break at a small clearing at the top of the steep hill we had just hiked up. The break came just in time. I threw off my pack and laid down next to the remnants of an old fire pit. The other two put down their packs and began pulling cooking pots and a small stove out preparing for what I assumed was to make some coffee or snacks. About the time everything was set up and the stove began blazing, a loud crashing noise came from the tree line, only a matter of feet away from us. We jumped up to see a massive bull moose charging out of the trees. We all scattered, trying to anticipate where the bull was headed. We were unable to get our rifles because we were laying against a tree behind the bull. None of us were stupid enough to make a target of ourselves by circling behind a raging moose. I found a tree large enough for me to shimmy up. From my limb, I saw the bull take aim for my uncle, who himself was still running in circles looking for a place of safety. Unfortunately for him, the bull was too close and managed to close the distance too quickly. As he came closer to my uncle, he dropped his head and drove his antlers into my uncle's chest and arms, which had raised to protect his face from the strike. The bull struck with such power that my uncle was driven off the edge of the cliff, that we had climbed up only minutes before and disappeared. The bull stopped at the cliff and looked around for another target, huffing the whole time. The guide took the opportunity to go for his gun. He took a big breath, aimed, and fired. The moose dropped where it stood. Once we were sure the moose was dead, we ran over to the edge, dreading what we would see. My uncle lay motionless at the bottom of the gravel-strewn hill. While not being a sheer and super tall cliff, it was still high enough to kill a man if he fell off of it. And at first, I was sure that's what happened to my uncle. To my relief, I was sure I could hear a quiet but audible moan come from him. We scrambled to the bottom as fast as we could, and when we got there he was moaning. The guide, whose name was Roger, swiftly took control and told me what to do to help him. He also told my uncle not to move in case he had a neck injury. Thankfully, he had landed on his back, so we didn't have to move him much. Roger went through a checklist of questions to find out the extent of his injuries. It was obvious that my uncle had a broken arm. The bone poking out from the skin on his forearm made it kind of, easy to tell. It made me kind of queasy, too, but I managed to hold myself together. I helped Roger create a makeshift splint for the break, and I did the best I could to keep my uncle conscious. My biggest fear was he would go into shock. Roger pulled out his weird-looking radio thing that I later found out was a satellite phone and called for a way to go home. A helicopter came to evacuate my uncle. Luckily, the outfitter we were using required his guides to be certified in first aid. His knowledge provided him with the ability to give a rescue team a very good idea of my uncle's injuries and condition. He saved my uncle's life that day, and for this I'll always be very thankful, and every year when I see him at the hunting camp I thank him again. The chopper arrived about 30 minutes later and took my uncle to the hospital. The list of injuries came up to the compound fracture of the ulna, 5 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and a compression fracture of the thoracic vertebrae. He spent the next couple of weeks in the hospital, and when he was released, we took the first flight home. The next year or so was quite a battle for him. The ribs and the broken arm healed pretty quickly, but the 2 surgeries from the fractured vertebrae left him laid up for almost another 6 months, and the after effects from the concussion have left him with some long-term memory issues. As if it couldn't get any worse, he's been forced to live with constant pain to the extent that he has to wear a morphine pump. I would expect any man to give up and spend all his time at home, but he's never let this whole mess ruin his life, and he's still been able to keep a smile on his face. He still attends the hunt every year, although he's left the hunting part to the younger men, and he and Roger have become pretty good friends. Oh, and by the way, when we got back we realized we had completely forgotten about the moose. We had written it off as an unfortunate loss, but a week later we received 2 large parcels from British Columbia. One was 100+ pounds of moose meat, and the other was the mounted head of the bull. He was indeed a fierce-looking creature. The note included simply said, "Here's a reminder of your trip. Get well soon, Roger." Thanks for watching these allegedly true, scary camping stories. These were some truly creepy tales, honestly. Personally, I recently got a wilderness permit to camp at some local state forest in my areas this spring. Hopefully, I don't end up coming back with a creepy story of my own. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, as it really helps me out a ton. If you're new to the channel, why not subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new video. I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. Do you want to share your story on a future video? Be sure to send it in at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Are you looking for more spooky stories and true crime from the swamp? Then check out the exclusive Spotify and iTunes podcast. Be sure to head over there, give me a 5-star rating over there as well, because it helps me out and it helps me be able to continue to create these podcasts. I really appreciate all of you so much, and I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.